Andreas Malm works in the Department of Human Geography at Lund University. He's a scholar of human ecology and environmental history and has written several great books, including The Progress of This Storm, Fossil Capital, How to Blow Up a Pipeline, and White Skin, Black Fuel. Wim Carton works in the same department as a human geographer. The main focus of his current research is the relationship between society and nature and how society-nature relations are informed and changed by ecological crisis. Right now he's writing about culture, political economy, and climate action with a special emphasis on the promises of carbon removal. In this conversation we talk about their new book, Overshoot, the first of two books about the state of the climate crisis and the question of whether cutting emissions from fossil fuels is a purely technical or primarily political challenge. The second book will be called The Long Heat, which is a title that gives a name to the era that we're now entering, where powerful state and corporate interests continue to block even meager climate action, making loss, damage, suffering, and basically mass sacrifice seem inevitable, even somehow normal. Now, after the election of Donald Trump to a second term as US president, it's clear that, quote, the days of thinking that the US will ever be a reliable partner on addressing global warming are over, in the words of New York Times reporter Coral Davenport. It's hard to maintain hope in this moment, and that question of hope is something that comes up a surprising amount in Overshoot. Malm and Carton are suspicious of the palliative rhetoric of hope in the climate movement and how it tends to inoculate more active feelings of anger, frustration, or grief. That said, they are a lot more suspicious of the rhetoric of hopelessness that's presented by those who are resigned to 1.5, 2, or 3 degrees of global heating. Overshoot is based on the notion that since there is supposedly no hope of cutting emissions in time, we have to plan now to hurtle past our climate targets and pray that technology, adaptation, and a little bit of luck will let us bring things back within the realm of safety after we've blown our carbon budget. The deferral of the burden is clear, but Carton and Malm break it down in a way that explains more fully how Overshoot allows fossil capital to endlessly defer, stranding its assets, to completely avoid any real disruption. This means that, as Wim puts it, resource radicals and eco-socialists who see a massive transformation as the only way forward have to bet now on the possibility of rupture as a response to business as usual. As this episode drops, representatives at COP29 will be debating whether or not to pick up their dismal efforts where they left off at COP28, when fossil fuels were finally identified as the root cause of the climate crisis after decades of dicking around. This absurd situation is captured perfectly by Wim. Nothing really happens and we're constantly adding more and more carbon to the atmosphere, he says, which means that, by definition, we're actually going to exceed those targets. Whether we're ready for it or not, blowing past the targets will come with extremely severe risks. Malm says that, quote, the only way to avoid the situation spinning completely out of control is to go after the drivers of these disasters, and that is the constant, ongoing investment and reinvestment in fossil fuels that is happening everywhere. So I'm hoping we can kind of just, break down the what, the when, and the how of Overshoot, in a sense. Like, reading the book, it feels like the what of it is simply that you now have a conscious policy of staving off having to actually do the disruptive work of mitigation, of climate mitigation, by adopting this kind of, for the ruling classes at least, very self-serving ideology that, like, if we exceed 1.5 and more, then there will be some future Deus Ex Machina solution that will handle the costs of mitigation for us. The book does certainly concern itself with what you call the show of COP, right? Year after year, the show of COP and what gets codified at COP. Is that where you see the Overshoot conjuncture, as you call it, first emerging, was really in these kind of international summits? And where else does it kind of appear and then sort of get mainstreamed as a way of, like, looking at the science, acknowledging the science, accepting the truth of it, and then saying, well, but the temporality of acting in the face of that has to be one of deferral. Like, when does that get normalized from your perspective?
I mean, in a way, we're talking about when we're talking about overshoot, we're talking about multiple things. There's like, different things going on there. And we kind of make a distinction between what we call programmatic overshoot, which is this idea that emerged mainly from the science, right, from integrated assessment modeling, which we have a large section unpacking. Um, and essentially that says essentially that we will shoot over these temperature targets and then we will use carbon removal to take temperatures down again. So overshoot here is overshoot and return. It's coming back as well. Um, but at the same time, of course, you have a situation where we are on the verge of actually exceeding these limits, and we I mean we are in a conjuncture in the sense that these cops have kind of normalized a situation where nothing really happens, and we're actually constantly adding more and more carbon to the atmosphere, and we're actually going to exceed these targets. So it's both the exceedance itself and this scientific program for normalizing, exceeding, and then returning again.
Hmm. But then you also point out that it has to come with a political project. Because there is this moment where you sort of acknowledge that it's also a political decision, like it's a policy decision. Um, but what I find really interesting in the sort of overshoot, I'm not going to call it the overshoot thesis, but your thesis about the normalization of overshoot is that you, as you say, we can see how perfectly overshoot harmonized with the functionality of these models, right? There is this kind of almost genocidal logic, right, to that sort of political position, that some people are just expendable. Some people must be rendered disposable in this throwing in of the towel. And you say, like, then, okay, there's an acceptance of that logic in the pages of The Economist or wherever. But then specific technologies and techniques have to be also sold as a means of giving it some kind of substance, right? And did you want to talk about the three that, as you say, stand out: adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, and geoengineering?
I can jump in. So the the question to which these three things pose a kind of a combined answer is, what do we do when it's too late
Mm,
to prevent a warming of 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees? And
mm-hmm,
there's just a limited set of options for what you can do, and the kind of trio of options that has been crystallized in this discourse is precisely these three things. So what you can do is, one, you can try to live with these changes as best as you can. That's the quite old idea of adaptation. Two, you can try to take down the excess of CO2 from the atmosphere that has caused this transgression of these limits. And this is really at the core of the, as Wim laid out, the programmatic overshoot. So
mm-hmm.
at the center of this concept, that this notion that you can go beyond these boundaries and then return back below them. Or third, you can try to block incoming sunlight and have this immediate reduction in warming by means of some kind of solar geoengineering. So, if you look at, for instance, the Overshoot Commission, this kind of informal little micro panel of diplomats trying to deliberate on how we're going to manage this problem, these are like the three prongs: adaptation, carbon dioxide removal, solar geoengineering. Now, Wim and I are working on a second volume here, which will be considerably longer than the first, where these three will feature, but where the focus will be precisely on carbon dioxide removal, because
Okay.
yeah, like we said, this is at the core of the overshoot conjuncture. Although we don't know how much of it will ever happen if it does, but yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's this faith in, again, like this kind of miraculous technology swooping in to save us that does have dangerous resonance with the public. You know, when I read Holly Jean Buck's Ending Fossil Fuels, one of the things she notes is that we really do have to be deeply concerned about the seductiveness of cleaner oil,
of abated fossil fuels. Some of the throwing in the towel rhetoric that we're seeing is extremely concerning. And I wanted to kind of talk about like why it might be that otherwise, like, quite progressive organizations would be interested in advertising the inevitability of missing the 1.5 goal. Because I myself, I'm tempted to kind of reinforce this seemingly very dangerous mantra of like 1.5 is already blown. Why is it important to keep that alive?
Yeah. I mean, this is, I think, one point that we struggled with, and it's exactly, I think, why there's two notions of overshoot in here, right? I mean, the last 12 months were, I mean, every single one of those months exceeded 1.5 degrees. So obviously, I mean, this is what defines the overshoot conjuncture, right? Where it is moment of time where, we are about to cross this threshold, even if, the
Right.
official definition is there's, an average of multiple decades before you can actually proclaim that. We are at this moment in time where, actually staying within 1.5 degrees is a, it's a very, very, very tall ask. And so when we're arguing for this, I mean, for me, it's in a way an argument for recognizing that, whatever is going to be kept alive is in part a function of, the kind of the societal discourse and the ideologies that you create around these things, right? And so obviously, if you keep saying it's not possible, that has a performative function. And so the
Sure.
antithesis to that is to show that alternative futures are in fact possible, right? And that we can be more radical and more urgent in our mitigation policies than we currently are. And that's always a frontier, I think, that is worth kind of pushing forward. Um, and so irrespective, and this is why, I mean, I think we try and remain a little bit agonistic when
Hmm.
it comes to, whether or not 1.5 degrees actually is possible. We outline these kind of, two kind of discourses around it.
Hmm.
To me, it's not about this particular limit. It's about, whatever next limit comes, right? I mean, to show that,
Sure.
this kind of notion of possible or impossible needs to be unpacked, and one needs to kind of, I mean, yeah, it's just, we need to push the boundaries of what is possible. That's what all of this is about, and that's what Overshoot essentially denies.
Yeah, I do feel like that's entirely what's at stake, and that the sort of acquiescence to the world as it is, which you unpack, especially in financial terms, right, for a lot of the book, is itself this, yeah, kind of death sentence. And yeah, I mean, like there's a moment in the introduction where you say, if 1.5 was in the spotlight during those years, it will be 1.7 next, then 2, and so on. The logic of overshoot potentially reappearing at every identified limit. And it's only possible for that sort of acquiescence to a neoliberal death pact. This is why in the book you're arguing that to leave it to later generations to deal with this mess means that you misunderstand what kind of mess you're dealing with. Like there is, of course, a point at which adaptation is impossible, right? And I think part of the point, certainly, of the exhaustive list of climate disasters you provide at the beginning of the book is to reinforce that notion. Andreas, lately, I've noticed you saying that like summer is the season of climate disaster. How hard is it, do you think, to kind of reinforce this idea that we need to be that we need to be horrified by climate disasters and connect the dots for people?
So this, I mean, we're on the threshold of another summer of disasters, most likely.
Right.
It's not a very bold prediction that this summer will, in the northern hemisphere, involve a lot of extreme weather events. I mean, it's already started with extreme heat waves in Southeast Asia,
Mm-hmm.
and the flooding that happened in the Persian Gulf just the other week, and events like this. Now, I think that people generally have this kind of apprehension nowadays when they
Mm-hmm.
approach summer. So, for instance, when I was in Paris the other week and spoke to people about this, France is a country that has, in recent years, been pounded by these wildfires and heat waves and droughts in
Mm-hmm.
summertime. And yes, people, well, my impression was that yes, people are again expecting that it will be another bad summer. The problem is, I think that people feel completely powerless about it, and supremely depressed in the sense that they know that there's a very high likelihood that bad things will happen again, and that they might be worse than in recent years. But people generally don't feel that they can do anything about it,
Mm.
or that it's a moment for some kind of politicization or intervention uh, into the trajectories of this planet. So what what I would kind of personally wish is for these moments of climate disaster that are coming in the near future to be turned into moments of political contestation, in the sense that when you see these, if the next season of, let's say, very bad wildfires in France, you have some sort of climate movement stepping in and doing something reasonably spectacular to drive home the point that these events are not natural, they're
Mm-hmm.
not predetermined, they're not a fate, they are politically created. And if business as usual continues, we will just see more of this, and it will, by definition, become worse. So
Mm-hmm.
if we worry about these things, the only way to avoid the spinning completely out of control is to go after the causes, the drivers of these disasters. And that is, the constant, ongoing investment and reinvestment in fossil fuels that is happening everywhere, including a country such as France, where the single largest private corporation is Total, one of the most aggressive companies when it comes to expanding fossil fuel infrastructure around the world. And it's precisely that link between these disasters and the investment flows that needs to be made, and that's where a political subject has to
Hmm.
kind of materialize. And
Mm-hmm.
unfortunately, we're still some way away from that, because normally what these disasters trigger is a kind of discourse about how we're going to live with this in a better way. So, for instance, when there have been wildfires in France in recent years, you will have Macron going out and say, we need to get better water bombers and a larger fleet of planes to be able to quench these fires and stuff like that. So we need to adapt better. But that's, of
Right.
course, a complete illusion.
It's a zero-sum game. I mean, the adaptation at a certain point is a failing strategy if that's the way you're approaching these disasters. I agree. And I mean, it's like very interesting to hear you expand on that because, I remember reading in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, this sort of desire for of a kind of leveraging of crisis that in the spaces that I circulated in Canada is seen as crass. And often it's seen as like opportunistic and dismissed in this country, which is different from France. I mean, you've spoken recently about how France is very distinct in its political culture. And there is maybe more receptivity to that sort of translation of crisis into greater solidarity around what needs to be done. But I guess, there are lots of different directions that we could take it, but I wanted to pick up something that you said about like really digging down to the nature of the engine that drives climate disintegration, which is the fossil fuel industry. Just one of the litany of examples that you give in the book is that during the decade leading up to February 2022, Norway awarded as many licenses for exploration, 700, as in the preceding half century for oil, making this not only the biggest producer, but the most aggressive hunter among European countries. While it seems like you're just describing the hunt for resources, it also evokes this image of a predatory animal. The other metaphor that I saw you using and working through to kind of understand the criminal nature of the fossil fuel industry is that they're involved in what you call a carbon bombs arms race. That metaphor, which now is part of the discourse, kind of matters for understanding like exactly how much is at stake in terms of like blowing far beyond overshooting vastly overshooting the carbon budget that we have.
I mean, I think it relates to because we also, reference kind of a few studies that try to quantify like the amount of deaths that you can associate with every increment
Mm-hmm.
of additional carbon being added to the atmosphere. And I mean, it touches on the point that Andreas just discussed, in that I think that drives home, the implications of all, of all these disasters that we're seeing. It's like, there's real, there's, real deaths already occurring, right? So I mean, to me, this
Mm-hmm.
is the point of this language is kind of to, I guess, lift this into a more urgent discourse. And
Mm-hmm.
that's I mean, the carbon bombs, of course, comes from this Guardian article that tries to
Mm-hmm.
just show the magnitude of these projects that are happening. So
Yeah.
um,
Which had an impact. Like that article you point out did have this significant impact, but then the impact too there was attenuated by the nature of like a media cycle. I think the book even quotes a Salt song on like it should have been on every stop sign throughout the world. That particular article, the material, the content that was pushed above it was like stuff about the royal family, Harry and Meghan, and so on, right? So it becomes very difficult to really drive home how demonic the incongruity is between the disruptive change that needs to happen and the kind of pace of the perpetuation of fossil capital, right?
Yeah, but
Um,
I think
yeah.
the quotation from the Salt song is about another article, which is the one that said that once you cross the threshold of 1.5 degrees in average temperature increase,
Oh,
you
this
will
is
see
right.
these
Yeah,
lethal
that's right.
mega heat waves rolling through the tropics. And
That's right.
the headline that the Guardian used to report this this scientific paper was that something like the tropics are on the way to becoming unlivable, and that was
Unlivable.
placed below the latest news from the Hagen and
You're right. I
Hagen
conflated
and
the two, but
no,
maybe
no,
the point, the point stands, right? Like in both instances, you ought to have this kind of plastered in the public sphere, and that is maybe it's just the absence of a public sphere that prevents that sort of mass communication. But I think like Overshoot is about trying to diagnose that problem too. Like you say, in the physiology of this highly peculiar type of society, no synapses connected the information and experience of the catastrophe unfolding with the centers of decision making, right? There is this unbelievable abyss between those two things. And in the middle of it, you say at the end of that sentence is energy, and nothing, beyond these sorts of very, like your book is extraordinary, but it's not the easiest read, right? It's long. You have another book coming up that's longer. How do you give people a way in? Do you think that we worry too much about like that work of knowledge translation on the left, and that we actually need to assume that we have a receptive audience for making these sorts of like connections clear between, destruction of business as usual, the birth of a political movement that can take power, and the end of fossil capital? But when a book like this comes out, you have to on some level worry about its political efficacy, right? Or maybe you don't.
maybe I should defer to Andreas here, because
no, but let me just say that I think that this compulsion to be hopeful and optimistic and to kind of end on some kind of a bright
Mm,
side with on a cheerful note where readers will feel buoyant about the state of the world and the future and all the possibilities for, yeah, I don't know,
mm,
we don't I don't we don't see that as honest. I think one of the sort of general points we try to make is that we have to be honest with ourselves about how bad things are,
right.
and about the extreme difficulties of finding a path forward. That doesn't mean that anything is technically materially impossible, but the climate crisis has reached a stage of extreme severity, and everything suggests that it's going to get worse in the next few years. And this we need to face up to this. And
Mm-hmm.
an honest and meaningful political intervention has to be founded on, I think, a frank, lucid assessment of the pretty bleak predicament we're in.
Hmm.
Is that, would you agree with that, Wim, or what do you?
I mean, absolutely, and I mean, we have a critique of this kind of hopium, language that kind of
Opium.
pervades
Yeah.
hopium,
Yeah.
especially in the UNFCCC and so on. So, I mean, I think we're both a little bit allergic to that. But I mean, I guess your point is also like, I mean, so I mean, it's true. These are, it's not maybe an easy book to read for everyone, and it's, it has a niche audience in some ways. Of course, we try to I mean, we're trying to, I guess, be as accessible as possible and entertaining along the way to the extent possible within this super depressing topic.
Hmm.
Um, but I mean, I don't know. I mean, I already feel that there's, so much more nuance we could have added, and so much more material, and so much we didn't touch upon. So I mean,
Hmm.
I just I have no desire to write like a short pamphlet. There's plenty of those, right? I mean, in a way, it's like
Hmm. Hmm.
it's easy I don't know. It's easy to come with critique, but it's also easy to come with like a manifesto that is detached from political economy in a way. So.
Yeah, and I think the choice that you made is like a very politically responsible one in a sense. Like you're trying to provide a resource that is more than the manifesto that Andreas wrote with that lovely little orange book that got so much attention, right? Like in some sense, like that book serves the purpose of trying to provoke and adopts a little bit more of that kind of breathless manifesto tone. You're doing something very different here. You are sobering and strident about like the real impacts that we face and the tipping points that we're coming up against. You don't shy away from those, but you're also aggressively advocating for something other than this economic logic of sacrifice that seems to be the ruling ideology of our time. So I think like one of the things that the book does really generously is give people a deep dive into what asset stranding represents. You say that asset stranding would be the politically induced destruction of value, awaiting or undergoing valorization within the circuits of fossil capital. All in all, you're stranding the largest network of infrastructure ever built, tens of trillions of dollars of assets, 2 centuries of technological evolution. The tricky part of that is, as you say, the reason it represents an impasse in a lot of people's thinking is that there's this tendency of fixed capital in oil and gas exploration to keep growing. What's like the other side of that seeming impossibility of asset stranding as rupture?
I mean, in a way, the asset stranding part, I think, is a rather sobering and depressing read because it really
Mm,
conveys the entwined kind of layers of capital that would topple over like dominoes the moment that you actually enforce something like this, right?
mm-hmm,
Um, and we go through some of these different layers, and I think we could easily have added others on top of it, of course.
mm-hmm,
That just of course is a reflection of the total entwinement of fossil capital with every aspect of how our economy works because of the energy system and everything else.
mm-hmm,
So I guess one of the main dilemmas that we point to is that I mean, because of the kind of um, I guess anxious nature of financial markets and I mean, especially financial markets, the moment you start doing this in one aspect of the economy, you have no idea where this is going to end. And I guess this is the specter that we talk about, right? This kind of
mm-hmm,
this self-perpetuating kind of stranding logic that takes hold of the economy and that kind of um, I mean destroys everything. So I mean that's in a way that's of course what the anti-revolution as we call it is born out of, right? This is what people are trying to prevent. But on the other
Mm-hmm.
side, I think is what we point to in the conclusion is that I mean there is, in our understanding at least, no real theory of how you actually go about that, right? How do you we talk about this crossing the bridge while everything falls down, right? I mean everything, this stranding would have to happen on such a scale and at such a rapid pace at the moment that inevitably, you have no idea what the consequences would be and how far the
Mm.
dominoes keep toppling. Um,
Right.
so there is, I think, on the left and in the climate movement, no real theory of how to go about that. And that is the kind of the key yeah the key point that we come to in the end.
Yeah, and I mean, like, we're left then at the end of the book in this really restless place, I think, because you're not offering a political program necessarily. You're giving glimpses of it, but I feel as though where you kind of land is that it is between an orderly or a disorderly transition on some level. But disorderly versus order, like, what do these terms even mean?
The the reason that we spend time on the question of investment in fixed capital and the spectrum of asset stranding in this book is that the sort of beating heart of this overshoot conjuncture is the perpetual investment in fossil fuel infrastructure. And this is what
Mm-hmm.
calls forth, at the most fundamental material level, the idea that we need various kinds of technologies to deal with the problem of global warming while at the same time allowing us to continue as we're doing now. So, various types of technologies for carbon capture, for instance, have been largely touted and advocated as shields around these assets that will prevent them from the fate of stranding. So, for instance, the idea that, okay, if we put a CCS filter on a coal-fired power plant, we can keep that power plant running without having any emissions. This hasn't actually worked out in reality, but it's been incredibly impactful as an ideological construct that has kind of created the image that we can detach emissions from the assets and keep the assets in place. And
Mm.
this is very much the sort of ideological function of all the hype around carbon dioxide removal technologies, that they sort of create this semblance of a possibility of keeping these assets in place and continuing the process of valorization and avoiding asset stranding. So I think what we're trying to do with this first volume is to really drive home that point that uh, the core reason for the mess we're in right now and the way that this mess gets worse and worse and worse is precisely these endless cycles of new capital being poured into these assets and the way that the dominant classes, if you will, come up with various ideas for how to protect them from destruction.
Mm-hmm.
Do you agree, Wim?
No, absolutely, and I think this is why this notion of the overshoot conjuncture as starting in 2018, I mean, symbolically, I think is so powerful because, I mean, we've seen all of this happen in the last, 5, 6 years, right? I mean, this massive mega profits that, the fossil fuel industry reaped from, I mean, first um, um, the I mean, the consequences of the recovery from COVID, and then, of course, the
Mm-hmm.
war in Ukraine. Um, and I mean, I think it perfectly illustrates the madness of the situation, right? This kind of, while we've never had so much recognition in a way within the science, within the climate movement, even within society as a whole of the urgency of this matter. We have like record profits in the fossil fuel industry and record investments in continued extraction. I think this kind of illustrates this kind of demonic nature of it and sets the conditions for this. Yeah, these kind of different strategies that are being pursued to maintain that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see that as well. I mean, it's a convincing argument, right? And captured in a way in these two questions that you raise in the book. Is it merely a segment of oil and gas companies that stand between the rest of us and a stabilized climate? Or is it technical necessity that still ties us all to fossil fuels at this late hour? um, it's clear, I think, what your answer to that question is. The self interest of these corporations will cost us the earth, and it is not a technical question. And numerous reports have kind of demonstrated that we do have the capacity to make the shift. What are your thoughts on like financial mechanisms to try and drive down emissions, which also feels like it's part of Overshoot to some extent because there's a real gradualism to that. In Canada, this is a real problem right now politically, right? Carbon tax has really damned the Liberal government to, lose, almost certainly lose the next federal election. Do you feel like primarily these sorts of financial mechanisms are distractions? And what purpose do they serve from your perspective?
I mean, we deal with this to well, we'll see to what extent, probably to a large extent, in the
Mm.
second volume, where we talk quite a
Mm-hmm,
bit of
mm-hmm.
offsetting. And the reason is that, I mean, offsetting in many ways is integral to this whole overshoot conjuncture. All of the
Sure.
ways in which removal is currently being positioned as,
Mm-hmm.
as an alternative to acid stranding is exactly through offset. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's a huge distraction, and it's I mean, of course, we analyze it through this kind of lens of overshoot, this notion of wanting to use carbon removal to return temperatures again to these temperature
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
targets. um, and I guess the analysis that we provide and the conclusion we reach is that if you're going to use these financial mechanisms, particularly offsets, then it's a recipe for failure. It's a recipe for failure. It's a recipe for super regressive forms of climate policy, of course. I mean, you have that with
Mm-hmm.
carbon taxes as well. Um, it's not going to work, and it's very clear who's going to, be the winners and the losers of this. So.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And it only becomes worse in a way with these kind of novel forms of carbon removal, these kind of industrial direct air capture kinds of technologies that are super expensive, and it's the Bill Gates of this world that can afford them essentially. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so you end up in a super aggressive place that's probably not going to get you down to any temperature limit again.
Yeah, I mean, it really gets us fighting amongst ourselves as well. Like having to defend a carbon tax is never a position that I want to be in, but I've been in that position too often. Um, what you're calling for instead is rupture, and I like this term, the law of excluded rupture, that you use in the book. It reminded me of this sort of, this phrase in How to Blow Up a Pipeline, right? Of the elders of defeatism, that there's this kind of like law of excluded rupture that says anything like a climate revolution is so beyond what we can imagine. But you say that's precisely what needs to happen, if only because of this sort of the what you call the heft and rootedness of fixed capital. You say capital loses some of its proverbial agility in this context and might become loyal to old technological schools. I wanted to kind of unpack that in terms of like degrowth versus like green growth. Do you feel like in our fighting over degrowth versus a Green New Deal or green growth, this other system is like maybe developing very rapidly behind our backs? Do we miss actually like a further enclosure of energy infrastructure by now green capitalism?
I think one of the points that we make in this book is that there isn't an energy transition happening really
Hmm.
anywhere, because an energy transition would mean shutting down fossil fuels and replacing them with renewables. What
Hmm.
you generally see is an energy addition where renewables are stacked on top of a base of fossil fuels that keeps being expanded. This is the general pattern in the US, where you have continuous expansion of new oil fields from Alaska to the Permian Basin. All of these relentless.
The fracking, carbon
yeah,
bomb.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and and Gulf of Mexico just goes on and on and on. ExxonMobil and Guyana or whatever. So I think we would be in a very different situation and would be much more optimistic about things if capitalism was actually engaging in an energy transition, which it isn't, unfortunately. The whole debate around degrowth versus a Green New Deal and these things. Well, yes. Also, one of the points that we make in the book is that this sort of debate, it has its value, of course, but it largely fails to grapple with the key issue of how do we throw a real spanner in the process of just relentless expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. The debate very rarely deals with questions of asset stranding. How do we induce it? What would it mean to do so? What would be the political conditions of possibility for that to happen? How would we navigate the crisis that would unleash? These more hands-on questions around intervention into these cycles of expansion do not really figure in this debate, which is in a sense much more abstract about it. Can we have growth or not? Well, it's of course a debate worth having, but it doesn't really make contact with what's going on the ground as we see it. So the book is to an extent a plea to the climate movement and to radical political ecology to give more attention to the question of how do we actually induce the meltdown of this kind of property that just has to disappear. But it gets, it becomes more difficult the more of this property is being built up all the time.
Yeah, right. You say fixed capital does not have to be immobile, but it must possess a durability consist of, say, metal, not soap. But it must, even that seemingly indestructible thing will someday meet its maker, right? Either being washed away by sea level rise or deliberately stranded through a political decision. Yeah, I mean, you're again, I think, speaking to the emergence of this new kind of political subject, as it were.
I don't know. I mean, this is why we don't come with a ready answer of our own, right? I mean, this is I think the gist of the matter, and this is why. I mean, it's easy to again criticize, right? But it's I think the reason we arrive at rupture, of course, is because of the urgency of the matter, and because exactly the fixed capital stock keeps increasing. So there's and obviously this is about what political subject do you actually need to do that, and how do you build that, and of course it has to go through the state, and how do you seize state power in time to do all this. I mean, it raises all kinds of super large questions, right? And we're not naive in the sense that we think this is gonna come out of nowhere, but it's ultimately, I think, the only pathway possible to do this, and this is why it's super urgent to start asking these questions, and as you say, move away from gradualism, right? This is also one of the things that is central to the second volume, this kind of the need to kind of dismiss with notions of gradualism as the pathway out of it. But it raises all kinds of difficult political questions, for sure.
And I mean, the problem with gradualism is that what you get is a lateral move, and what you need is this rupture, is this leap. I really appreciate this book. I'm really looking forward to the second volume, which is it called The Long Heat? Is that right?
Yes.
The book makes it clear that 6 IPCC reports, 26 COPs, and immeasurable suffering has not yet gotten us to the place where this transition is even happening. So books like yours are still incredibly important for helping people think through this ongoing impasse. So yeah, thanks for making the time. I really appreciate being able to talk to you about the book.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah.